Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in the SERDP and ESTCP webinar series. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntac Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. Today's webinar will consist of a brief overview of the two programs, followed by the technical portion of the webinar, which will aim to provide a status update of SERDP and ESTCP funding efforts on PFAS, as well as project results from a SERDP-funded project on an innovative approach for the treatment of waste derived from PFAS subsurface investigations. Dr. Andrea Leeson will provide an overview of SERDP and ESTCP's PFAS efforts, with a focus on the highlights, on project highlights on managing investigation-derived waste. Dr. Leeson will also discuss upcoming SERDP and ESTCP PFAS solicitations, as well as publicly available PFAS resources. Her presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. Then we will transition to Dr. Dave Major from Savron, who will talk about PFAS destruction through smoldering combustion, a sustainable and cost-effective technology to treat PFAS contamination in both soils and investigation-derived waste. Dave's presentation will also be followed by a Q&A session. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in case you experience difficulties with the broadcast platform. Firefox, IE, or Edge are the most compatible browsers to use with Zoom. If you lose the content on your screen or if your screen freezes, try keying Control and F5 to perform a hard refresh. If you are accessing the audio through your computer, click the arrow next to the Join Audio button, select Test Speaker and Microphone, and follow the prompts as they appear on your screen. However, if you continue to experience difficulties, feel free to call into the conference line shown here. You may also submit a comment using the chat box. Please use that chat box only for comments related to technical difficulties. The Q&A option should be reserved for questions for the speakers. Today's broadcast is listen only. You may submit questions by using the Q&A box on your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A periods to submit your questions. We really do encourage you to submit questions as you think of them. And when submitting your questions, we would appreciate it if you can add your organization name at the end of your question so that we can identify you during the Q&A session. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrea Leeson, who is both the Deputy Director and the Program Manager for the Environmental Restoration Program area within SERDP and ESTCP. Dr. Leeson has been with SERDP and ESTCP since 2001, and before that, she was a research leader at the Battelle Memorial Institute, where she conducted scientific research on in-situ bioremediation and the design and implementation of innovative biological, chemical, and physical treatment technologies for site remediation and industrial wastewater. Andrea received her doctoral degree in environmental engineering from the Johns Hopkins University. Andrea?
Thanks, Rula. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today. What I'd like to do before we get into the technical aspects of our webinar, I'd like to give you an overview of SERDP and ESTCP and who we are and how we function. And SERDP and ESTCP are two sister programs that we're within the Department of the Defense, and we are their environmental technology programs. SERDP is really our science and technology program, or what you might traditionally think of as the R&D, established in 1991 as a partnership between the DoD, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. And a lot of our work there is conducted at the lab scale or bench scale. And ultimately, when that knowledge or technologies mature, they would move into ESTCP, which is our demonstration validation program. And this is where we take those technologies or a knowledge base out of the lab and into the field, establish cost and performance of technologies, partner with end users, the regulators, and very importantly, We're looking at the technology transfer of those technologies that are developed so that end users can implement them in the field at their sites. We have two main drivers. The first is sustaining our testing and training ranges and facilities and operations on DoD bases, and this is what really drives our solicitations that we release. You can see it's very broad, from maritime sustainability to noise issues, sustainable forward operating bases, UXO, munitions constituents. So it really covers a broad range of needs of the Department of Defense. We also need to reduce the current and future liability on our installations, and so that really falls into two broad categories. One is pollution prevention, and this is to control hazardous processes, technologies, chemicals that are used and are needed on the DoD installations. But what we do is try to develop, eliminate hazardous materials and develop more environmentally sustainable processes. And then we also are looking at contamination from past practices, whether that's in groundwater, soil sediments, and it has included some of the large chlorinated solvent plumes, but also some of these emerging contaminants, particularly in this case in the last couple of years is what we've been dealing with is PFAS, and we'll be talking about that a little more today. When we develop the technologies, then it's very important to us to do the technology transfer, to make sure that the knowledge we develop gets out to end users or anyone who may need to use these technologies. And so our technology transfer has taken a number of different tacks, from videos, in-person training. We've developed many different guidance documents, manuals, etc. And then one of the cornerstones are these webinars. All the webinars we conduct are archived on our website so that you can go back to our website and pull up information from older webinars. So we see this as a very key way to transfer technology. If you go to our website, and the website's listed here, you can get the archived version of all the webinars we've had. We have one more coming up on chlorinated solvents and groundwater in December, and then our full list of webinars being offered in 2020 will be available soon at this website listed here. And registration is easy. You can go to this website and click through to the webinars you're interested in listening to and register for future ones. I'd also like to mention our SERDP and ESTCP Symposium. It's coming up quick. It's December 3rd through 5th in Washington, D.C. at the Marriott Wardman Park Hotel. This is a 3-day symposium, and it represents really everything that SERDP and ESTCP are funding at this point, whether our investigators present through posters or through platform presentations. You will be able to see pretty much everything that's being funded, and so it's a really valuable symposium. Registration is, of course, open now, and I encourage you, if you have not registered for that, to consider attending. So at this point, I would like to move on to our technical portion of the webinar, and first I will be talking about the current status of SERDP and ESTCP efforts on PFAS. I'd like to first give you more of a broad overview about our program in this area. And then I'm going to focus in on one of the particular statements of needs or research areas that we've had, talk a little bit about some of the projects that are successful coming out of that effort. And then I would also like to talk about some current solicitations that we have out now in this area on PFAS, and closing with some resources that have been developed based on SERDP and ESTCP efforts. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the EPA published their provisional health advisory for PFAS and PFOA in January 2009. And that same year, we released a statement of need that was to look at in situ remediation of PFAS contamination in groundwater. So this graphic is showing you that this solicitation was released in 2011. It actually came out, it was released in 2009, but that is for projects to start in 2011. The in situ remediation is the brief title of the statement of need, and in parentheses after is the number of projects we ended up releasing under that statement of need. So looking back, we can see that was perhaps a little bit of a naive statement of need that, you know, okay, let's do in situ remediation of these compounds in groundwater. And we quickly realized that this was a much more complicated issue, and this has led to a much larger program as shown here in this slide. So let me talk a little bit about what you're seeing in this slide. And what I'd like to really point out is the website at the bottom of the slide. And if you go to this website, it will take you to an interactive graphic that you can get all of the information, all the public information we have at this point on the various projects that we're funding. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit at the end as well. But what you see on this slide is roughly the top half represents SERDP statement of needs that have been released. The bottom half represents ESTCP projects. Under SERDP, each statement of need that was released, there's a brief title for it, and in parentheses after is the number of projects that were released, and it corresponds to the year in which the projects were initiated. In ESTCP, those represent individual projects, except for in 2019, we released a group of projects to look at demonstration and validation of fluorine-free alternatives to AFFF, aqueous film-forming foam. These were not new formulations. These are formulations that are in use in other countries, in Europe, Australia, and what we're doing is testing them in the field to see how they meet the specifications that we need in the DoD installations. But for the most part, everything else there is representing a single project for ESTCP. This now represents roughly about $100 million worth of funding since we started in this area, and it also is roughly a little over 100 different projects that are tackling this issue from many different areas. What we also do periodically with SERDP and ESTCP is we have workshops, strategic workshops, where we bring together experts in the field to essentially brainstorm for 2 days and talk about where we're at with a particular issue and where we need to go. And so we did that with PFAS. As you could see from the previous slide, in May of 2017, we had a workshop where we were looking at, we did an overview of the current state of science regarding PFAS, and then we really tried to prioritize and identify research data gaps that needed to be addressed within the next 5 years or so. And this is all summarized in a workshop report. The link for that is at the bottom. And we've identified 28 different research, demonstration, and technology transfer needs. And that really drove a lot of our research over the next few years. Shown here are some of the major findings from that workshop, and you can see this is pretty broad, starting at state and transport properties, as well as bioavailability, biomagnification of these compounds, different toxicity issues, forensics, sampling, as well as a continued need for treatment technology demonstrations. And we identified some specific technology transfer needs. So going back to the overview slide, what I'd like to focus on today are the projects that were selected under a statement of need that was released for projects starting in 2018. And it was focused on developing innovative approaches for treatment of investigation-derived waste, of waste laden with PFAS. These were intended to be proof of concept projects. So roughly that means about a year's worth of effort, generally under $200,000 for that year, very specifically looking at treatment of materials such as soil cuttings, purge water from sampling groundwater monitoring wells, fluid from decontamination of drilling equipment, just this kind of investigation-derived waste that we were collecting at DoD installations, and it was a problem with what to do with this waste. And what we were looking for specifically was preferably destructive technologies, and we wanted to find mobile or temporary treatment systems that could be used on site. And we also preferred, of course, would like them to be cost effective compared to current disposal methods. So we were really trying to avoid having to ship these materials off site to an incinerator as much as possible. So we ended up funding 18 different projects. They are shown here with a very abbreviated title, as well as the last name and the organization of the lead investigator. The projects in white that have no shading associated with them, these are ongoing projects. We have not yet seen those results. And yes, it's due to the government contracting process, not everyone starts at the same time. So that's why some of these projects are completed, some are not. And that's why you'll see the discrepancy. The projects shaded in green, they are essentially just now complete and are still under review. So we're going through those projects now. And the projects shaded in blue are now complete, have been successful. And what I'd like to do is talk very briefly about those projects, really direct you to where you can get more information. And these are projects where we're following up and we're going on to investigate more in depth about scaling up these processes. So the first project, what I'd like to talk about first is just to direct you to our website. You'll see that, for example, this has a number associated with it. It's project ER18-1570. And if you search for that project number on our website, the project website will pop up for this project. You can also find it by searching on the lead investigator's last name. So I encourage you, if you'd like more information about the projects than what I can cover in this talk, go to our website, search either one of those. Their project website will pop up, and that project website serves as a repository for any documents that come out of the project. Most of these projects that I'm going to discuss right now, this has all been very new, it's very rapid. Their final report is not posted for every single project just yet, but we have them and they will be posted soon. So this first project was led by Chris Sales from Drexel University, as well as partners from Temple University. It's the application of non-thermal plasma technology for removal of PFAS from investigation-derived waste. And what he was looking at was developing this non-thermal plasma technology for treating both liquids and solids. And he was looking at the degradation and defluorination of PFAS, as well as looking at the associated energy costs for this type of treatment. He was able to demonstrate that the air plasma rapidly degraded PFCA, PFSA, and FTS compounds. And so he will be following on with this effort, really looking in more detail to understand the mechanisms and the transformation products of the air plasma degradation of PFAS. But also now that we're scaling up, he will be looking at improving the engineering and design of these technologies so that we can have a more energy efficient, larger scale application. Keep in mind, these are all intended to be more on-site mobile technologies. So we're not really talking about a tremendous scale up. So it's all to develop these on-site technologies. The next project was led by Tom Holson and his team from Clarkson University, and he also had folks from GSI Environmental. And this one was looking at plasma-based treatment processes. Again, this was really focused on soil investigation-derived waste. And what they looked at was conducting soil washing, followed by treatment of that washing solution in a plasma reactor to destroy the desorbed PFAS. The water alone was shown to remove a large amount of the PFAS, and adding the sodium chloride and methanol resulted in much better removal. And then the plasma treatment itself was very effective at destroying those desorbed PFAS. So the future efforts are going to focus on doing these soil washing tests under more realistic conditions, looking at other washing solutions, and developing the engineering of this pilot scale system. The next project was led by Don Zhao at Auburn University, and he was looking at a technology to develop a new class of adsorptive photocatalysts that can absorb and photodegrade the PFAS from the investigation-derived waste for both water and soil. And this project also was able to develop 3 novel photocatalysts for PFAS degradation, showed very good adsorption rates and photolytic activity towards PFAS and PFOA, and was able to show that the materials can be reused in multiple cycles without having to add additional regenerant. This project also is going to build on, and what we're really looking at is further testing these photocatalysts, and again, scaling up to get the engineering we need to go to the sites. The next project I wanted to talk about was by Dave Major at Savron. I'm really just going to touch on this because Dave is going to talk after me to give a much more detailed summary of what they did in this project. And we had Dave speak today in this area because Dave was the first one out of that group of 18 that completed their project and is ready to move on and upscale. But essentially, this project is looking at smoldering combustion and developing that an on-site system for treating PFAS in this way in soils. So what his project involved was adding GAC, it could be other substances as well, to support the smoldering combustion of the PFAS. And what he'll be looking at in the future is to look at optimizing this application so that we can look at different soil types and also using real site soils to test treatment. Also within his next effort, we're actually going to look at pilot testing at a DoD facility. The next project was led by Ezra Cates at Clemson University with also assistance from the Navy, EXWIC, and Battelle. And this was a pilot scale assessment of a deployable photocatalytic treatment system for investigation-derived wastewaters. And what he did in this was develop these photocatalytic materials for PFAS destruction, and he's incorporating that into an existing commercial deployable reactor system. The initial efforts here were very successful, able to identify these key process parameters. The catalyst he chose looked to be quite successful at destroying these compounds. And so what we'd like to do is move on, looking at applying this on a bigger scale, possibly looking at other catalysts in that system. And that work should be initiating within the next few months. So what I'd like to move on now is just giving you a little bit of an overview of a couple of solicitations that we currently have out. For those of you who may be interested in applying for these solicitations, the first one is officially an FY20 supplemental solicitation under ESTCP. And what we're looking at is demonstration and validation of environmentally sustainable methods to clean firefighting delivery systems. So this is of particular concern to the DoD. We have a lot of these firefighting cleaning systems that have been using the fluorine-containing firefighting foams for many years, and what we're looking at is to be able to really clean them. And so it's not just looking at the new cleaning methodologies, but also looking at technologies that can treat any rinsate or residue that's derived from the cleaning process. Those proposals are due soon on November 21st, and you can follow the link there for submittal instructions. This is a supplemental solicitation, so the submittal instructions are a little bit different than our standard solicitation, so I do encourage you to look at that. The next solicitation we have out that has some information related to PFAS is our traditional FY21 SERDP solicitation that was released fairly recently. And the statement of need we have out on PFAS is dealing with improved understanding of thermal destruction technologies for materials laden with PFAS. And the statement of need is fairly broad. We're looking at a few different items there. We want new technologies or modification to existing technologies that can improve how we're dealing with PFAS-laden materials at this time in terms of developing the cost effectiveness and sustainability of those processes. We're looking to develop a better understanding of incineration in terms of really getting a full mass balance from inlet to outlet on the incineration process, understanding temperature requirements for destruction of PFAS. We also want to get an improved understanding of PFAS state during thermal reactivation of GAC or other carbon-based sorbents. We are looking to assess the fate and behavior of PFAS and co-contaminants during production and processing of residual product streams from technologies such as ion exchange, nanofiltration, et cetera. And we are also looking to develop novel or modified sorbents that could work towards having less intensive reactivation. Materials of interest then include soil, spent GAC, other carbon-based sorbents, these spent ion exchange resins, et cetera. And I should say that within that statement of need, there are several sub-objectives. Proposals do not have to address every single one. This in particular lends itself towards addressing one of those specific sub-objectives that are listed there. Pre-proposals are due January 7th. Please pay attention to the time and the submittal date. That's very important. We can't accept pre-proposals that are submitted after that. Please go to this link to look at the submittal instructions. The submittal instructions will be a little different from the ESTCP, so it's important to look at each one individually. I just then wanted to point out a couple of resources we do have available, specifically about work that's been done under SERDP and or ESTCP. This is the workshop report that I mentioned earlier that lists all of the data gaps that were identified during the workshop. We also have a PFAS frequently asked questions and reference document that is available. And then in this slide, this is on our website. You can go to this at the link listed at the bottom of the slide. This is an interactive graph. So if you'd like more information about any of our projects, this is where to go. If you click on one of the SERDP projects, or statement of needs, I should say, that's on the upper half, it will take you to a page that describes the statement of need and provides a list of all the projects that were selected under the statement of need. And all of those projects are linked to a project web page. So you can really go see everything we're funding in this area. So you can also get a little bit of overview at this website listed here, and that will lead you into different areas as well. At this point then, that concludes my presentation, and Rula, I can take any questions at this time.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. And as a reminder to folks on the phone, you may submit questions by using the Q&A box on your screen. Andrea, we got a bunch of questions related to specific projects and details on those projects. So I'd like to remind everyone that a PDF of Andrea's slides is available on the website under Tools and Training webinar series with the webinar with today's date. You can download the slides, follow the links, or look up the PIs on the SERDP and ESTCP webpage, and you can get all this information. It's very readily available. And as Andrea mentioned, each webpage has links with final reports or blogs or webinars or slides that are available for download for free. So right now, I'm just going to focus the questions that that have come in that are more broad in nature, Andrea, starting with a question related to specifically IDW projects. You mentioned that SERDP has funded 18, and some of them will receive continued funding for field demonstrations. Are you planning on funding additional technologies beyond the subset of 18 moving forward?
Well, under SERDP, that would really be within the context of a statement of need. So I wouldn't anticipate necessarily that we would release that exact statement of need again. But, you know, certainly as we move forward, you'd have to keep an eye out on statement of needs. If we don't think we have all the technologies we need, we would probably release another statement of need. And then, of course, under ESTCP, that solicitation will be released in January. Those tend to be fairly broad in terms of what we're looking for. So we would certainly also look at the topic area that's released then, but I know PFAS will be an area of concern for a while.
Thank you, Andrea. We got a question specific to the types of organizations that you fund a SERDP and ESTCP, specifically if you favor small businesses or not, and how this all factors into your decision making. Do you mind giving a brief overview of who you fund and
Sure.
how decisions are made?
Our organization can really fund everyone. So we fund universities, small businesses, large businesses, federal labs. We fund investigators that are located in the U.S. We fund investigators located outside the U.S. So we really don't have a preference there on where an investigator, you know, what kind of organization an investigator is associated with. It really all comes down to what makes sense technically.
Thank you, Andrea. And you mentioned the SERDP solicitation and the focus on incineration, which makes a lot of sense given the news. Are you planning to release the ESTCP call for proposal soon, and is there going to be PFAS on it?
Well, the ESTCP solicitation it's staggered with SERDP. So, you know, when SERDP comes out, you can generally expect ESTCPs to come out a couple of months later. So ESTCP's annual solicitation generally comes out in early January. Not sure of an exact date at this point, and I really can't talk about, you know, what we will request, but what you can do is go to our website, and if you look under our, there is a solicitation section. If you go to that, you can see past solicitations, and that will give you a good idea of the sorts of things we've been looking for.
Great, thank you, Andrea. So stay tuned, everyone, for those of you that are asking. This is a bit of a specific question, but it would be interesting to get your take on it. In all these technologies, this is from an anonymous attendee, in all the technologies that you guys are funding, are you targeting a specific limit for cleanup? Like, or are you just interested at this point in just evaluating whether a technology works or not, and then seeing what limits you can achieve, cleanup limits achieve with that technology?
Yeah, I think that what you said in the latter half is really more accurate, Rula. I'm not a policy person, so I can't comment on what the policy is. So, but what we've really been doing in the absence of some regulations on these standards is seeing what we can, you know, what are the limits of what the different technologies are capable of. And, you know, for example, like with the IDW, we're really looking at destruction. So I think that's the best I can say is that, you know, we're just trying to see the best that these technologies can do.
I think that's a really fair response. Thank you, Andrea. One more question from the audience. You mentioned that you're funding $100 million worth of work. Other than the webinar promoting the results of some of the projects, how do you intend to get the information out to the broader community of folks interested in PFAS?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that is a particular interest of mine, is technology transfer of all of this knowledge. Without it, the funding really has not been effective. So it's very important that we get that done. We work with our investigators and encourage them on an individual level to publish, to present on the results when it's appropriate, particularly under ESTCP. We ask the investigators to develop guidance documents about their technology that's been developed. We do short courses. We work directly, with regulators or at installations, giving informational courses on different technologies. So it's a constant effort for us to get this information out there, and we really do also rely on the investigators with their assistance to transfer the technology as much and as quickly as we can.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And one last question before we let you go. Do you have a final message that you'd like to leave our audience with today related to PFAS and the work that SERDP and ESTCP is funding?
Well, I feel very encouraged by the amount of work we're doing. It's a lot of work. But it's very targeted. It is a management effort to keep that all together, but we have a lot of excellent investigators. We have an excellent group, a working group of people made up from the military services as well as the EPA and other technical reviewers that are helping us really keep a handle on all of this work that's going on. I think we've been making tremendous progress so far. So I think we have a lot of progress to date, and I'm hopeful with where we're going with this.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This was very informative, and we appreciate your time. And it is now time to transition to the second portion of today's presentation, which will be delivered by Dr. David Major, who is the Managing Director of Savron. Dave has helped develop and commercialize remediation technologies, including zero-valent iron permeable reactive barriers, molecular biomarkers, bioaugmentation cultures, and most recently, Savron's Smoldering-based combustion technology, or STAR, and that's what we're going to be hearing about today. Dave has served on various national scientific advisory boards, including the U.S. EPA Expert Panel on DNAPL remediation and the U.S. National Research Council Committee on Geological and Geotechnical Engineering in the New Millennium. He is a recipient of several awards, including the University of Waterloo Faculty of Science Alumni of Honor Award in recognition of his professional accomplishments, the Space Hall of Fame Award for helping NASA commercialize a product, and the ICE Telford Premium Award for a key paper on ground improvement technology. Dave received his doctoral degree in microbiology and contaminant hydrogeology from the University of Waterloo. Dave, please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I would first like to start by acknowledging a few individuals. Alex Duchesne and Josh Brown, both who have been working on this project as part of their master's degree at the University of Western Ontario, and conducted the smoldering experiments under the supervision of Dr. Jason Gerhard, one of the inventors of smoldering combustion for remediation. David Patch, who's doing his PhD under Dr. Kayla Weber at the Royal Military College of Canada. And both David and Kayla have been assisting on the analysis of PFAS and other compounds. Also David Reynolds of Geosyntec and Gavin Grant of Savron, who've been helping with design and technical analysis. All of these folk are the reason I can look so good. So let's start off with the agenda. I'm going to give you an overview of the smoldering combustion. What is it? How does it work? And then give you an overview of our test and experimental setup so you understand our results that I'll be presenting to you. And then our potential applications and the future work that we must do, as well as the benefits to the Department of Defense from using this technology. So what is smoldering combustion? Smoldering is like any combustion process, and as shown in this combustion triangle, you need the fuel, oxidant, and heat all in the same place for combustion to occur. But what is different about smoldering is that it's flameless, energy efficient, and self-sustaining. And a perfect example that you're familiar with is the smoldering of solids like charcoal briquettes in a barbecue. The briquette is both the fuel and a porous media. All you need to do is use a resistive heater or a little flame thrower or something like that to ignite a small area of a briquette. And the heat that it starts to release from the combustion process raises the rest of the fuel up to its ignition temperature. And when oxygen is applied, combustion on the fuel surface starts to occur. This is evident by the glow of the briquette. The smoldering will continue until all the fuel is consumed, leaving ash behind. This demonstrates the efficient and self-sustaining nature of smoldering. When we use smoldering to treat contaminants in a porous media, like soil, we call it STAR. For STAR, the contaminated soil is the fuel. We get our oxygen free from supplying injected air. We use some low kilowatt heaters to start the process, and that initiates the combustion process itself, after which we can take away the heat source and have a self-sustaining reaction. Sludges, creosotes, tars, and other heavy hydrocarbons embedded in porous media are excellent fuels to support the self-sustaining smoldering. However, we have two challenges with PFAS. The first is we need a high temperature to destroy them, at least 900 degrees C. The second, PFAS are by themselves are not great fuels, which is kind of obvious as AFFF is used to put out fuel fires. That means we need to consider the use of a fuel surrogate. So what about GAC, or activated carbon? It is often used to treat groundwater to remove PFAS and other contaminants, and becomes a secondary waste that needs disposal. So maybe mixing the PFAS and the GAC together, we can now create a smolderable mixture. So the idea is that we can treat PFAS-impacted soil by mixing with a clean GAC as a fuel. Or we can get rid of the spent GAC by mixing the soil with other porous media. Or we can get a 2-4. We mix the spent GAC with PFAS and PFAS-contaminated soils, and we treat both problems at the same time. So our overview of our testing is I'll give you a quick run through of this. Our first test that we conducted was looking at just mixing clean GAC with sand at different ratios and in different air velocities. And what we're looking here for is, can we get to the combustion temperatures necessary that could start destroying PFAS? So we're looking at the gas profiles, make sure that combustion is actually occurring, and also looking at the temperature peaks that we're getting as well. Test 2 and 3, what we're doing here is that we're now going to take 3 PFAS compounds, absorb them to a GAC, and then mix it with clean sand. What we're looking for here is just the concentration of PFAS before and after smoldering. Our test 4 that we did, we took 3 PFAS compounds before, but this time we absorbed it to a surrogate soil, which was composed of topsoil and different sands to give a wide grain size distribution. And then we mixed that with clean sand, clean GAC, and then did that experiment with smoldering. And test 5 is where we absorbed it again, but we used 6 compounds this time to absorb to the surrogate soil, mixed with a clean GAC. In this case, we're looking, of course, the concentration differences before and after, but we're also trying to focus on what's coming out of the top. What are the emissions that we can get? Particularly, we're interested in the formation of hydrogen fluoride as an indication of complete mineralization or destruction of the PFAS, as well as maybe we're actually emitting other PFAS compounds during the combustion process. Our experimental setup is as follows. All the experiments were conducted in a stainless steel column that was about 60 centimeters long, 16 centimeters diameter. We have thermocouples that are placed along the side of the column at about 3.5 centimeter distances. We then supply hot air at the bottom of the column. A GAC and soil mixture is placed on top of the screen, and then there's a sand cap that is placed on top of that. We collect combustion gases, in which we're measuring CO and CO2. We were also having different streams looking at capturing volatile emissions, volatile organic compounds such as other PFAS compounds or breakdown products, and a charcoal and GAC that's put inside a ZAD columns. And then we also had impingers that were used to take out hydrogen fluoride. This is an EPA method 26. And that's basically collect those samples and then send that off for analysis as well. So I'm going to go through what an example of temperature profiles we can get in a column. And in this case, we're looking at GAC running at about 6% by weight, 60 grams per kilogram of soil, with an air flux of approximately 5 centimeters per second. So when the first thermocouple, shown by the blue line, located just as the screen reaches a temperature that supports ignition of the GAC, we turn on the air, and then we see the immediate spiking of the temperature at the second thermocouple, shown by the red line. At this point, the heater is then turned off, and we only supply air at this point, and we just maintain that flow. As we can see, all the thermocouples located in the GAC sand mixture indicate the average peak temperature exceeds 1200 degrees Celsius. The progression of the smoldering front through the GAC sand mixture can be seen through the successive overlapping thermocouple profiles. The overlapping, it's about the same or increasing temperatures indicates that we have a self-sustaining smoldering process. Well, now note the sharpness of the profiles, and that each thermocouple is at ambient conditions prior to the arrival of the smoldering front, even though temperatures are in excess of 1200 degrees Celsius, just 3.5 centimeters away. This shows the smoldering front is relatively narrow and that cooling is relatively rapid after the smoldering front passes. The smoldering front velocity can be estimated by the time it takes to reach the peak temperature between each of the thermocouples. The temperature profile you see in the sand cap without GAC, just showing the transfer of heat through advective and conductive processes. So let's go on to what we see here a little bit more when we conducted a bunch of these different experiments. And so this shows the average peak temperature with the different GAC sand ratios. The x-axis shows the amount of GAC added per kilogram of sand, and the y-axis shows the temperature in Celsius. As you can see, there's a relatively linear relationship between the amount of GAC added and the peak temperature. We also note, you can also see from here that you need at least about 40 grams of GAC to get up above 900 degrees Celsius. We also varied the air velocity. They found that it did not have a significant impact on the average peak temperature over the range that we tested. The air velocity did have an impact on the smoldering front velocity. And knowing that velocity is important to understand our process treatment times and when we're going to implement this at large scale. As you can see on the graph, at an air flux of about 5 centimeters per second, we obtain a front velocity greater than about 0.01 centimeters per second. For those working in imperial measurements, that works out to about a foot per day. So in thinking about this, if we're going to create a soil pile that we're going to treat through this particular process, we could treat a 6-foot high pile in about 6 days. So here's the results from tests 2 and 3. And recall, this is just the PFAS absorbed onto the GAC and then mixed with clean sand. In this case, we're looking at a GAC percentage of GAC around 4%. We're having a peak temperatures of around over 900 degrees Celsius. And with the 3 PFAS compounds, and done twice in 2 different tests here, looking at hundreds of milligrams per kilogram loaded onto the GAC, we find that our post-treatment concentrations are less than our quantification limit. So that shows that we seem to be removing the PFAS that is actually absorbed onto the GAC. In test 4, this is on, again, remind you, this is the PFAS on the surface soil with a clean GAC, and just using 3 compounds. We've increased the percent weight of GAC to about 5%, and there, of course, we see higher temperatures of over 1,000. In this case, we had lower concentrations on the surface soil, about in the tens of milligrams per kilogram. And again, we had non-detectable or below quantification limit of the PFAS in the samples and at the end. The other thing we're looking at, and then this is a really difficult part, we're trying to capture the fluorine. It was challenging to actually capture it effectively, but we did capture some, and in one test we managed to get at least 31% of the theoretical fluoride coming out as hydrogen fluoride, and that's based on the amount of mass we estimated that was added to the column. In test 5, we're looking at 6 different compounds. Again, similar percent GAC range, and again, in over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Again, we have below quantification limits for all the compounds that we added. What was interesting, though, we managed to, looking at the emissions in the DAD tubes, we did detect trace carboxylate compounds, but we did not pick up any desulfonated ones or any other compounds, as a matter of fact. It suggests that we are emitting some compounds, but we did have incomplete probably capture, and so we need to focus a lot more on our emissions and improving our mass balance on these through these testings. However, even if these compounds are emitted, we can capture them onto GAC, and we can use that as a fuel source for the next batch that needs to be treated. So we were asked to also think about how would you actually apply this technology if you're going to scale it up. Well, obviously, one thing about it is just looking at soil piles. So say you have GAC or another suitable solid compound. It could even be charcoal. It doesn't have to be GAC by itself. But assuming you have GAC that is a spent GAC from a groundwater treatment facility, we could then mix it with the either excavated soils or soil cuttings, and then we can then put it on what we call a hot pad. And a hot pad is just a low-profile engineered structure that has a screen for putting the soils on, but underneath that screen there's a plenum space where we have heaters and air distribution system. And basically we ignite the bottom, and very similar to what we saw in the column studies, you have this combustion front that moves through the soil pile. We collect the gases and do some off-gas treatment, and then we excavate the soil. So it's a batch system, and these hot pads are relatively mobile, and we can actually set them up and temporarily at different sites. And here's an example of what kind of a hot pad might look like. This is a project we were doing. This is a hot pad that holds about 200 cubic meters of soil. And in this case, we're actually loading on just hydrocarbon impacted soils. But imagine that dark soil is actually sand mixed with activated carbon. And then afterwards, when we excavate and take it away, you see clean sand at the end. So we do this for hydrocarbons, and we imagine a very similar process could be done for PFAS contaminated soils. The other applications, can you do it in situ? And we thought about this, and we said, yes, we could use traditional soil mixing technologies. We've often employed in the geotechnical industry for ground improvement. Again, we could take spent GAC or clean GAC, and we can mix it into a source area, or we can maybe create a permeable absorbent wall that actually absorbs PFAS and groundwater as it flows through. And when it becomes exhausted, we then smolder it, or star it, as we call it. And in this process, what we do is we actually install about a 2-inch carbon steel well with a stainless screen bottom. And then we put down these 9 kilowatt heaters down the center line, and then we provide air and turn on the heater. And what will happen is actually get to ignition temperatures in and around the well screen, the combustion process starts, and then we detect that through the collection of combustion gases. We then can turn off the heater, and then we just keep supplying air, and it basically becomes a glorified air sparging system. But this is ways we could do. We could treat the source area this way, and we could also treat the walls that have been installed, and then just regenerate the walls afterwards. Again, we do this on commercially. This is the picture on the left is a site in New Jersey. This is a 14-hectare site, coal tar impacted. The center gray pipe that you see sticking out is basically the ignition point that we use, which applies both the heat and the air. And the yellow lines are just the gas collection system. But we do this at this site. We did to about 13 meters below ground surface, up to 12 meters of that below the water table. And with this site, even with coal tars, we could get up to 1,200 degrees Celsius On the right is I'm just looking at the traditional soil mixing technologies that we can be used. So we're basically combining both of these things together to be able to treat PFAS in situ. So the key takeaways: the peak temperature is linear with your GAC concentration, basically wind dial in the temperature. The smoldering front velocity is approximately linear with air flux, and we can control how fast we process things. We can get over 900 degrees C with a little about 4% GAC by weight. We did get below quantification levels in soil, sand, and ash from the actual smoldering process. We get HF, which indicates we're getting complete decomposition. We may be getting PFAS compounds present in emissions, but we suspect it's actually also breaking down to other volatile organic compounds, which are not PFAS. But anyways, we could potentially capture and retreat that as a viable option. And there's potential in situ and ex situ applications of the technology. So our future work, we have to improve our mass balance. We need characterization of our emissions to be sure we know how to treat them off gas. We need to enhance our mineralization up to HF to help us also with the emissions post-treatment. And we're also looking at the impacts of scaling and heterogeneity, impacts on the efficiency of the process, and obviously collect and conduct a field demonstration of the real site soils and make sure that we can scale this process up successfully. The benefits to the DoD: we know that there's vast amounts of PFAS contaminated excavated soils and soil cuttings are present, and there's GAC from water treatments are being stockpiled. There's a lot of spent GAC out there. Currently, the only way that we can assure the complete destruction of PFAS is incineration, but that is extremely expensive, and we would like to hopefully see smoldering become a low-cost and on-site alternative for this particular problem. With that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Dave. We got a lot of questions coming in. The first one that we're going to ask you is one from the Navy. What's the potential maximum depth for in-situ treatment by smoldering?
There is a practical aspect about how much airflow we can provide. So that's really going to be the depth of the water column. For most of the contamination that we particularly see, I don't think depth will be really a limitation unless it was like hundreds and hundreds of feet deep. So I think that would be not much of a problem for most situations. Extreme depths, we can't go very, very far because we're going to have to put a lot of airflow and a lot of back pressure, and that should become a limitation of the equipment that's available.
Thank you, Dave. This is a question from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Did you test only the soil carbon filter per and post-treatment, or did you also test the air emissions? And if so, what sort of testing methodology did you use for the air emission test? For basically what we're using here for the air emissions, we're capturing the emissions onto GAC, which is then being extracted with the kind of modified 537 method. And then we're analyzing it that way. That's how we're basically capturing the emissions for the volatile organics. For the HF, that was method EPA method 26, which was basically involved passing the air through impingers filled with an alkaline solution, and then the alkaline solution is combined and sent off for analysis for HF. Great, thank you, Dave. This is a question related to the combustion process. Is shutting off the air enough to stop the combustion process?
Yes, generally that is exactly how we handle. If we need to shut down the process, we just turn off the airflow, and that usually stops the process. For liquid materials, the moment you stop, if you're working below the ground surface, the moment you stop the airflow, you also have the water will come back in eventually and stop the process as well. So yes, it's the simplest way to handle it.
Thank you. Is there a minimum % moisture required for optimum smoldering?
Actually, that usually we don't think about that's not usually the question I get. I usually get the question is like, well, how much water can you tolerate? We can basically work under water saturated conditions, provided that the fuel content is sufficient to generate the temperatures you need to boil off the water. In situ, what happens is we're usually pushing air behind the combustion front. So as a result, we're blowing into basically dry soil. So there is pushing of the water away plus boiling off. So we usually don't have a problem with water content. If it's dry soil, it just burns that more efficiently and we'll get higher temperatures because you need less fuel to get to the temperatures we need.
Thank you. And a related question to this, are there any potential natural fuel components that could negatively impact smoldering?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Are there any other components in the subsurface that would negatively impact smoldering?
Okay, so if there's other chemicals present, it's not necessarily going to affect the smoldering. It's like you got high temperatures, but things that could impact it basically is our ability to push air around. So if you got a really high clay content, so that could be that could potentially be problematic because we just can't push the air through. Though we can tolerate a certain amount of clay lenses and certain things like that. For the ex situ aspect, since we can take the soil out and would have to mix it with something like an activated carbon or a solid fuel source to allow us to smolder and get the temperatures we need, we can mix the soil and break that up or add other materials like sand to increase the permeability to allow us to push air through. But just from there's also engineering aspects of this as well in terms of like, subsurface structures and stuff like that. We need to be aware of them and engineer around them as well.
Thank you so much. This is another question from the Navy. Was hydrogen fluoride measured for and detected in all tests or only in test number 4 where you saw the 31% production?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That was really the best test we got. We tried it before and we had leaks in the hydrogen collection system because of the way it was setting up. It was a little finicky. So that was the only test we felt confident enough that we had numbers that we could actually calculate our percentage of HF born from the PFAS. So our next experiments we're going to be doing, we kind of think we nailed down how to collect the air streams much better and to give us better mass balance on the entire system.
Wonderful, thank you. This is a question from DuPont and it relates to greenhouse gas production. Do you have any idea or have you considered how much greenhouse gas production is required per kilogram of PFAS treated before breakthrough of the PFAS from smoldering? Or another way to think about this question is, how much PFAS can be treated compared to kilograms of greenhouse gases created? And I think this alludes to the energy intensiveness process. So maybe you could put it in context compared, for example, to incineration, which is our default destructive technology, Dave. All
right. I haven't done the calculation that you're asking for, but just intuitively you say, well, the amount of CO2 they're going to release is equivalent to the CO2 content, mostly of the added fuel that we add. So we can potentially get these kind of temperatures also maybe using other fuel sources like, say, wood or other maybe biochar, and so that will change the actual calculations about the CO2 or impact or the sustainability of the process. And remember, we're only using a very low amount of energy to start the process. Again, when we're doing the project before in New Jersey, that was just a 9 kilowatt heater to get the process going, and we run those for a few hours to maybe a half a day, and then we turn them off. So the amount of CO2 is really going to be mostly derived from the contaminant mass that we're destroying or the fuel that we're adding, and that could be calculated, but it would be relatively small compared to other technologies. We've done sustainability evaluations comparing like the smoldering process to other technologies. It compares very favorably because of the energy required to maintain it compared to incineration or moving a lot of materials around or excavation and stuff like that.
Thank you, Dave. This is a question from the California Regional Water Control Board. How long do you think it will take in terms of a time frame to complete the combustion cycle or the smoldering cycle in situ? If you were to take this to the field, what is the expected time frame for a remedy like this?
Well, that is a question of we can size the hot pad system to get the throughput we need to meet certain schedules. But just if you're thinking of, so that's just really based on the square footage of the hot pads. But the actual, and also how deep we stack them as well. So that's the total factors that come into, which is the throughput of the soil we have. But what we need to think about is how quickly that smoldering migrates through that soil pile. And in this case, if it's an ex situ pile, we basically count on about a foot per day progress through a soil pile. So if you have something that's 5 or 6 feet tall, and it's spread over a wide area, you can see you could treat a large volume of soil in 5 to 6 days. But if you have a smaller square footprint, then you're going to treat less volume each time. But the total time to burn through the depth of the 6-foot pile will be about 5 to 6 days. In situ, we have somewhat similar combustion velocities, or they're typically half a meter to 30 centimeters. I'm switching my imperial metrics again. 30 centimeters to like 60 centimeters a day, depending on the material we're pushing through.
Thank you, Dave. This is a question relating to the analytical methods that you're using. So if you've indicated that PFAS was not detected in the post-treatment matrices, what type of analysis did you use for that determination?
Okay, that was done by a modified 537 method that was done by Kayla and the Royal Military College. So that was very similar to what the current methodologies are using. So it was slightly modified, given our certain particular matrices and everything else.
So the EPA method. Great, thank you.
Yes.
This is a question from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Have you considered recycling the air emissions?
Yes, we have. That is a potential way to look at that. There is complications in terms of we need to maintain the oxygen profile to keep it moving forward. And so if we're to get depleted oxygen, we have to factor that back in. But the other option we thought might be the easiest way to do is just run it through something that is a media that could be used as a fuel in the future. So if you absorb it back onto GAC or some other resin that is combustible, we could then put that back into the soil mix for the next batch and treat that again.
Thank you. We've received a lot of questions about the fuel that you could potentially use. One specific question indicates or suggests that coal is cheaper than granule activated carbon. So could you mix in simple crushed coal rather than GAC? When you answer this question, Dave, I'd like you to talk about why you're specifically using GAC in this study. And then address why you could, what other fuels can be used to reach your smoldering objective.
Yeah, the simple answer is that we could use other fuels and other solid phases as long as they have the energy density that will allow us to get to the temperature we need, and it's not uneconomical to mix it to the concentrations you need to get to those temperatures. But the reason why we looked at GAC is because it's often it's used to filter water from purge wells. It's used for current groundwater treatment systems that have PFAS on there. It becomes a spent compound. And so it might very well be, that might be the most economical way of looking at this, is that people have got this contaminated material and they're trying to get rid of, and they might give it to you for free, one thing, or you could buy it for a low price compared to their or they might even sell it to you because it's a much cheaper price compared to actually sending it out to be regenerated. So there's different ways you can look at that. That's why we focused on the GAC. We know that it's actually contaminated a lot of times with PFAS. We thought back to the idea, can we get a 2-for treatment? We'll treat your contaminated soil and treat your waste GAC that's sitting at your site.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe they'll pay you to take the contaminated GAC.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you mentioned a minimum temperature of 900 degrees to get to PFAS mineralization. Have you tested lower temperatures to see if those would suffice? I think that's something that we'll be looking at in the future work that we're going to do. We haven't done that specifically. Our goal was for, based on what we understood, is that around 900 degrees, you start really decomposing the materials, and higher should result in a more complete mineralization and less production of other volatile organic compounds. Well, that was our goal at the time. Great. All right, we're going to start wrapping up, but the questions are still coming in, Dave. So I'm going to ask you a few more, and then we'll go ahead and remind everyone that they could reach out to you directly for additional information. This is a question from the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. Does smoldering affect the soil properties for certain uses? What is the impact on soil from smoldering?
Oh, good question. It's generally, it doesn't have too much impact. You will get some conversion of some clay materials from one form to another. Geotechnically, it doesn't have much of an impact at all. So we haven't seen that part, but we do find that something is interesting. We can find that sometimes smoldered soils actually are really good at growing plants in it sometimes. It doesn't take much amendments. There's some phosphates being released, so we can revegetate materials relatively quickly, and we found that it can be microbially repopulated after treatment relatively easily too.
Thank you, Dave. And a related question from an anonymous attendee, does the smoldering treatment have any negative water quality impacts to groundwater?
I can't imagine it does, unless we're, the short answer to that, I can't think of it, that it will have a negative impact. We haven't observed any negative impacts to the water. I think it's a question of, like, if you're working in, say, a coal tar material and you're breaking it down, and are you forming some lighter molecular weight compounds that escape to capture and dissolve into the water, you might see some of those particular compounds forming. But it really is a function of what materials you're treating and what they can potentially break down to and escape, dissolve into the water afterwards.
Great, thank you so much. And one last question, I promise. What kind of safety precautions or constraints may be needed if you were to implement this technology in the field? And since you've mentioned that you've already implemented in the field for other contaminants, maybe you could start with what precautions you took for those applications.
For any kind of, for the big project we did in New Jersey, we had 200,000 labor hours out there without any health and safety incidents. So really, it's the setup of the system where we are having you are producing emissions. You have to make sure you have proper control of that and monitoring of emissions from combustion, smoldering. You're going to have carbon monoxide as a combustion gas, so you need to be able to treat it or you need to control it, and you need the proper monitoring devices for that. And often slip, trips, and falls is on any construction site or any kind of remediation site. We also make sure that we're thinking about electrical and tag out, lock out procedures. Mostly those are the major health hazards we worry about, as well as associated with the drilling and all those particular factors. General construction and good hygiene, those are the major health and safety issues we've had to look at and consider in our designs and our operations.
Great, thank you so much, Dave. This was really informative. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up, but remind everyone that they could reach out, they could look into Dave's project on the Startup ESTCP webpage. That is, there's a link on the page or on the slide prior to this. If we can go back to this slide, please. You can also email Dave or call Dave at the numbers shown on that slide. I would like to remind everyone that our next webinar is right after the SERDP and ESTCP Symposium on Thursday, December 12th. It's the week after. It is also in the Environmental Restoration Program area. This webinar will detail results from DoD-funded research on reagent application techniques for remediating groundwater contaminated with chlorinated solvents. We're going to have two speakers. Dr. Steve Richardson from GSI will talk about an innovative application of a geotechnical technology to improve the delivery of amendments at sites with low permeability. And our second speaker will be Dr. Craig Devine from Arcadis, who will talk about an in-situ remediation concept for controlling long-term mass discharge at chlorinated solvent contaminated sites. Registration is open for this webinar, so please make sure to visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for this and other future webinars. And before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage. In case you would like to refer to them in the future, we would appreciate it at this time if you could please take a moment to complete a very brief survey that will pop up on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you.